Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com and today I'm here with Nathan Meunier. Welcome, Nathan.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show.
Oh no, it's gonna be super fun. So just a little introduction. Nathan is an award-winning journalist and freelance writer who covers video games, technology, and geek culture. He's also an indie game developer and has non-fiction books on game journalism as well as indie publishing. So that's pretty exciting. But Nathan, tell us just a bit more about you and your writing and gaming background.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a nerd, actually.
We all
um,
are. We all are nerds.
I started out writing about a decade ago. I was a journalist for a newspaper out of college. I got a gig just doing straight regular world news in my community. And after doing that for a couple of years, I realized that I needed to change. I wanted to do something else with my writing focus because I've always been really interested in entertainment writing. I've always wanted to do book writing, and it's something that took me a while to get to that point where I felt ready to do that. But I eventually shifted over from journalism to freelancing, and I started doing that part time as like a side hustle, sort of, just to kind of get some money and just get a feel for how to do it. And back when I started, I didn't really have a clue what I was doing, and a lot of the books were geared towards a different approach than the more technology-driven way that we do it now. And so I sort of shifted over into freelancing. I started freelancing full-time, specifically covering video games and tech and geeky topics. So I would review video games, I would interview people, and do sort of journalism-style work for publications, print magazines, and websites. And I've been doing that for a long time. And then a couple years ago, I finally got comfortable enough to branch out into self-publishing, and that's been a really exciting adventure. So I'm right now I'm doing book writing a lot. I've got a bunch of few books out now. I'm doing game development, which is sort of a newer thing I've been working on, and I'm still freelancing full time, and I'm not doing as much traditional journalism style work, but I am freelancing more for companies and clients and in the techs and geeky space. So very much game focused and it's kind of nerdy, but I spend a lot of time doing sort of entrepreneurial business development things on the side too.
Mm. And why I wanted to talk to you, obviously, is about gaming. That's what we're
Yeah.
going to talk about today. And it's funny. Well, there's a couple of really basic questions I want to talk about first. So many authors are gamers, and I know many of the listeners will be gamers, but there will be people who also are not gamers. And in fact, I hear many authors talk about gaming as a sort of competition for attention, and kind of scared of gaming and how it takes people away from reading, and children shouldn't be gaming and all that type of thing. So how do you, like, what's your opinion of how gaming and reading and books fit together in a sort of milieu?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think they're very different, but they all kind of connect in different ways. Um, as far as the time thing, I mean, games can be very time consuming. We're now sort of in the digital age where we've got, always buried in our cell phones, or we've got, Kindle books up, or we're reading, and or we're playing games, or watching movies, or there's streaming internet television now. So there's so many different things that can take our time and attention. And gaming is a really interesting way to interact with stories and characters and worlds, these fictional worlds that people build. And you can't get that in the same way from reading a book, but I think there's also things you can get from reading a book that you just can't get from playing a game. And especially as the game industry is sort of evolving, and the games, they're becoming more elaborate, more visual. There's a lot of opportunities, I think, for more storytelling to happen. And some of the characters in the games of today can be a little bit one-dimensional, and maybe some of the people that are making them aren't always writer focused or story driven focused. They're coming from a design perspective and a technical standpoint. But there's some really cool opportunities to kind of bridge that gap with more enriched narrative, and deeper characters. So I think in the future, there's a lot of opportunities for games and books to kind of merge in a way that benefits creative people in all on both sides of the fence, really. So whether you're a fiction writer looking to consider expanding into get your characters into a game, or creates a product that is game-like alongside your series, or whether you're a game developer that wants to do more story-driven content. I think it's really some interesting parallels sort of between the games industry and the self-publishing and writing industry. And I think there's some really cool ways that that's going to merge in a positive way, I think, for writers and people. So it can be time consuming. Yes, you could spend 80 hours playing a game, but I think some people like to disconnect and not be plugged in and constantly wired in. So having the ability to sit and read a book, or even if it's on a Kindle, kind of detach and be mobile and read, I spend a lot of time reading, and I'm a nerdy gamer person, so I mean, I
Yeah.
spend
Well,
quite a bit of time.
that's really what I want to know. So, as somebody, you read, you game, you're a writer. When, like, from a psychological perspective, like, when do you want to game, and what does that give you, like, emotionally or psychologically or whatever? And then when do you want to read? Like, if you just, can you break it down like that?
Well, for me, I'm a little bit different because I spend a lot of time, like, I take pleasure out of writing and working and creating things. So a lot of my free time is spent writing books or working on game projects. So I have less time now to actually play games just for fun, and I'm spending more time like building them and writing about them. And but I think there are times when I just need to turn my work creative brain off and just experience and be like sort of be immersed in a world, an interactive space, and not feel like I have to be thinking, okay, well, I've got to work on this, and let me polish that, and let me put this out. And it can be overwhelming when you're doing a lot of different things like that, and that's sort of how my brain works. So sometimes just unplugging, from work and actually being able to sit and play a game on, my iPad or fire up my Xbox and play, being able to sort of experience that kind of artistic creation that game developers are doing is it's interesting. It's a different way. So as far as like my time spent, I don't spend as much time gaming now, but I seek out games that are the kinds of experiences I can't get from watching a movie or reading a book. So most of the games I gravitate towards are very unusual. They're artistic. They're typically made by smaller indie studios that are going out of the box in terms of what they're building. So games will these developers will create very unusual, very interesting products you don't see very often from the bigger AAA games and the more high profile studios. I seek out the kind of quirkier, weird type games that fulfill me on a different level than what I would get in other kinds of content.
Can you give us an example? Because I mean, I really seriously, all I can think of is like first person shooter type games, but yeah. I know it's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that like there's some very typical like you're playing a game, you're shooting people, or you're. But I mean, some of the games that I'm trying to think of some titles off the top of my head. Most of the games I enjoy are from small studios because they have that flexibility to be creative and have more control over what they're doing. Speaking of like games in a narrative sense, there's a game called Portal, which not necessarily an indie project, but it's a game where you're first-person game you're exploring. Instead of shooting someone, you're solving puzzles in a space. So it's very you're kind of progressing through this infrastructure of this building. But what makes the game interesting beyond the puzzles is that there's this sort of dark narrative that's happening along all the while, where there's this artificial robotic AI that is talking to you over the intercom, and it starts off very sort of like matter of fact, but as you play, there's a personality that starts to develop from this robotic character that's talking to you. And you don't see it for a very long time. And it gets very passive aggressive, and it's just almost like this dark humor that sort of creeps in. And for me, that makes that game so much more interesting. And it's maybe like a game you can play in a couple hours. And it's very popular. There's a sequel that came out. But that kind of interaction where you don't really you don't know what you're getting when you go in. You start playing, and then it sort of unravels into this dark, warped, interesting experience. And I mean, that's a good example of a kind of game that makes me want to play more games and make that time for that.
Well, it's so interesting because when you think about a book, when someone reads a book, the book is done. They have the interaction. Yeah. There isn't an interaction. You are consuming what the author has written. Similarly with TV and film, but is the big difference with gaming that what you choose, so you are acting on the environment, and then things happen because of the choices you make. So is it more empowering, I guess, to play a game?
It's very cause and effect for sure. I mean, when you're developing a game, the idea is there's a lot of these. If this happens, then that happens. So there's this cause and effect that you're creating, and you're making these branching options that people can explore as a player. And from a player standpoint, not knowing exactly how things are going to, like having that control to interact with this fictional world in a way that you can cause this to happen or progress the story in this way, and that there's all these branching paths. I think that's sort of what makes game design and gameplay as a player perspective interesting, because there's not necessarily a finite A to B to C to D experience. There's these branching paths you can explore, and even though a lot of games take you on a very sort of linear track, there's a lot of opportunities to experience different kinds of things depending on your personality as a player, how you'd like to play. And then there's this other option of, there's this idea of unlockables and achievements. You're making progress towards something. And I think that's really interesting in a way that makes you want to come back and keep playing a game beyond just experiencing it from a start to finish story type perspective.
And I find that so interesting because that's kind of how we write a story. It's like, if this happens to this character, then they will behave that way. And so there doesn't sound like that much difference, except you have to have a whole load of options. You can't just write one way through. You have to write multiple ways through, which to me sounds like more creative. So gaming companies obviously do employ writers, but what do they actually do? Like you mentioned, design aspects. How does a gaming company or a small indie company work in that way with creators?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have as much hands-on experience from a writer. Usually, what I'm writing about is about games instead of for them. But more recently, I've been branching off and doing that with my own indie studio. I think a lot of the experiences that developers they'll work on a game and think of features and gameplay. But something that can really inform that is the story and the characters. So I think in general, a lot of the work that a writer could do for a game can inform how the rest of the game can play out in terms of how it's designed and built. I've heard of writers developing these like Bibles for a game where it's this entire world and backstory that never gets seen by the players, but it sets up the team to get their head in the game as far as how this is going to play out from a designer's perspective. So maybe there's all elements that you don't even know about that inform how the characters are developed or how the story and the game world where the game takes place is created. So I think on one level, you're doing some of that to an extent with some projects. On another level, you're doing character development and dialogue, creating dialogue and branching trees. Like that's sort of the big difference between straight fiction and game development is you have these branching paths. So someone has to write all these different things and scenarios and that could play out. And while it's interesting to do it from a game design perspective, I think the games are going to be more interesting when you have someone who has skill to write the story and characters. Sometimes you'll see games that have a very one-dimensional characters and it's just big meathead guy with a gun, like pew pew pew, right? So like that's fun on a certain level, but the characters that are deeper than that show the kind of stuff you would see in a more elaborate, evolved fiction universe where there's emotion and feeling and narrative and conflict. The things that make a story interesting, those are the kind of things that need to be injected into a game to make that click for a lot of people. Some people just want a casual experience where they're running around and shooting things, but a lot of people that want more from their games, especially people that are into the different kinds of games that are not the traditional shooter or whatever, they benefit and they look for games that have that. So, at a writer perspective, you're going to be doing a lot of, depending on the project you're working on, a lot of character development, a lot of story, narrative, branching paths, and then sort of world building as in general. And that sort of can also inform the design of the other aspects of the game.
It's so interesting, and also to me it sounds so obvious for people to want to get into. So if one had a series of books that one might want to have developed into a game or work with gamers, like what's the way that authors can get their books or their stories to gaming companies? I mean, because are there agents specifically for gaming, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky because I don't know. There's some different ways. I mean, I think the way that a lot of writers interact, I think, with the game companies is on a freelancer basis. So as a contract worker, if you are an author who is familiar with freelancing and do freelancing already, that kind of sets you up to be in a good position to make that shift. Oftentimes, I would even recommend just reaching out to companies to see, maybe they have projects in the pipeline where you could connect. And I think a lot of the big companies will need writers. Even smaller studios can benefit from having writers. The indie studios oftentimes will have people on board that kind of create the stuff themselves, but there's opportunities there to kind of become part of a team or on a contract basis contribute. So I think one of the best ways to probably start doing that is think of it as a freelance contract type work and reach out to studios. If if you have game experience, that's great. If you don't, you might want to spend some time kind of thinking about that and getting familiar with games and the narratives and how things work. And then that will set you up to kind of reach out and make those connections. Oftentimes, I think if you can connect with the right people, the right studios that are interested in those kind of things and building a world and building a game that's more evolved, story-wise and character-wise, it wouldn't be hard to pitch like say you've got a series of books, like say Jeff, you just want to get involved in their project level, getting those first couple projects under your belt before you kind of trying to do your own thing, that might be a better idea. But I'm sort of rambling. But from an indie game development perspective, you can do it on your own and sort of get started. And this is where you kind of have to learn sort of some new skill sets potentially, or find a small creative team that has the interest in working with the writer. You could either pitch your world, like I've got this series and check out my books, and they can see that you have quality writing. That might endear them to saying, oh, well, this is great, let's see what we can do to build a project around this. Or you can build a pitch that get involved and create a project with them as a thing. So
it's
approaching
it's about relationships, and
it is. You have to kind of build those relationships. It would probably be easier to get involved with a smaller indie studio team. If you're thinking on a creative standpoint, that might be the best way to go. There might not be a lot of income initially in that approach. But if you already have books and you want to just kind of branch out and explore that, you sort of have to get that ball rolling. And
I think it's the same as film and TV and everything. Relationships make such a difference. So before we get into the collaboration side, you've talked about indie studios and stuff. What is it like publishing? As in, you've got the mega Sony and stuff, and then you've got indie studios. I mean, is it the same as sort of the publishing industry in that way?
There's so many interesting parallels between creating games and publishing games in the industry and creating self-published books and traditional published books. From a game development standpoint, it's sort of a little bit more integrated. So there's indie studios, which are essentially small teams, oftentimes small teams of a couple people or one person creating games, and there's opportunities to self-publish through different channels. So Steam is a big one for on PC. And there's a process to get onto that. Also, there's the App Store for iOS, for your iPhone and whatnot. Those are a little bit more independent friendly, so you can get on those without having to go through too many different gatekeepers. If you want to create games for the Xbox or Nintendo Wii or Sony, there's a little bit more of an involved process, and we've been going through that with some of our own teams. So when you do make that connection with those bigger companies, oftentimes they have a sort of self-publishing option. So they might say, we want to take your studio under our wing and produce your game and whatnot. But most times they're saying, we're going to allow you to produce on our platform, and we're going to let you do your own thing, but we want to just approve it before it comes on. And I don't know the specifics of like the cut and everything in terms of money wise, but it's there's some sort of you think of it like Amazon KDP, where you've got they're providing the audience and the service and the platform, you're providing the content, they take a chunk of it, and that's very similar in how it works, I think, for a lot of places. But there's also avenues to do it completely DIY and completely do it yourself, and experiment in that way.
And customers also don't care where the games come from, as in most readers don't even know who published a book. Is it the same, or do people tend to a specific platform?
I think because there's so many different platforms, there's a lot of options. Some people will only buy a PC game if it's on Steam, so there's a little bit of that. But I think a lot of people, when they're looking for a certain kind of experience, or if they're intrigued by a particular game, they will throw down some money for it and get it wherever they can. Or sometimes they will buy it in multiple places because they want it in a certain format. There's a couple of games. Minecraft is a good example, where it's a building game in a sort of blocky world. It's very popular, and it was an indie project. I own that game on like 5 or 6 different devices because I got on one device and it's like, I can play it on my mobile phone now, or I can play it in here. So people will be dedicated enough to search out the content they want and then pay additional to be able to experience in the way a la carte that they want to do it. So it's very similar in that way with self-publishing too.
And it's on pricing as well, because you mentioned the apps there. Have these 99-cent apps, have they changed the pricing of products in the same way that Amazon's kind of changed pricing of books?
Yeah, it's been a little bit disruptive in some interesting ways. The App Store has kind of mirrored Amazon a little bit in that there's a certain amount that people are expecting to pay for a game on the App Store. So if you start charging $4, $5, $6, people are a little bit less inclined to do that, even though there are studios that are doing that and they're finding success. And now there's this whole freemium thing where you get the game for free, but then they throw on all these layers of microtransactions that you may or may not want to get. And a lot of people like that. A lot of people don't like that. It's sort of polarizing, but it's definitely disrupting the industry in an interesting way. So that's creating different approaches that people have to follow to find success on that particular platform.
Mm.
But people still will spend money on different platforms, different formats. Sort of the platform sort of dictates how what the pricing scale tends to be. So what is the average or norm for PC versus PlayStation game versus whatever? Yeah.
Yeah, and Minecraft was interesting, obviously, because I think the top books last year were actually Minecraft books. So it's actually crossed the other way, right? I mean, is that common to cross into books from gaming, or?
A little bit. There is definitely a whole series of different books that tie into the games industry. There's a big self-publishing section of the game world where there's tutorials on how to like program and code. And but there's one thing I was noticing that in the games category in Amazon, it's dominated by Minecraft books, and a lot of them are written by younger folks, I want to say, that are like children's stories, and they're these sort of fan fiction stories built in the Minecraft universe. And it's just wild because I was looking at that, and it's like there's so many books. There's like a whole niche of just Minecraft books, and I think because the game got so popular that all the kids everywhere are talking about it. Like at a certain age, at a certain grade area, that I remember, hearing from friends that have kids that were just like, "Oh, my kid can talk about this Minecraft." So they found a demand. Kids want to learn more about Minecraft. They want tips. They want this and that. They want to have stories built around the characters. So people started writing books, and it's become this weird niche.
Yeah.
I thought about delving into that myself, and I'm like, it's not quite where I want to be writing.
It is, but it's a very, from what I've only seen my young nieces and nephews playing it, the kids, and they're amazing, and they're like 8, 9, 12 years old, but they just love it, and it's very creative, isn't it, Minecraft?
It's a very big sandbox kind of world where you can just sort of explore and do whatever you feel like.
Yeah, so actually it's completely different to what a lot of older folks, I'm 40, what we think of gaming. Actually, Minecraft is more of a creative exploration type of thing. So, I think changing the opinion of games is really important. Has there been a shift, do you think?
I think so. I mean, there's definitely gaming has gone from sort of being you're a hardcore gamer to a more broader type audience. I mean, there's definitely different types of folks that are finding like my wife played games when she was a kid, and then stopped playing them for a long time, and she's gotten back into them. But she plays almost entirely on like the iPad. She'll play like these crazy games. I look over her shoulder and see, what are you doing? And I'm like, whoa, that's cool. You're building like a farm, and then you're building whatever. I mean, farming vegetables and creating pies and whatnot, or doing. I mean, they're not all farming games. She plays some other stuff too, but it's just interesting to see how different kinds of games can connect with different types of players. And there's such a broader range of experiences now that you can have, that you can find the type of game or the type of focus that you'd like to play.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you mentioned that my husband does the Clash of Clans thing, and he does it entirely free, the free version, and he's kind of proud of doing it for free. But he's been doing it for ages, and every day there's like you log in and do a little bit of something, moving things around, and I'm just like, this is addictive. And I look at this and I'm like, how can we make our books as addictive as these games? Like, that's a totally difficult question. Would you like to answer that?
Oh gosh, I don't know. There is sort of, maybe I want to jump the gun because this is something I want to talk about a little bit. But there are ways to kind of build these intersections. So interactive fiction being one way. So you can make your book that's more of a book-like experience and kind of tie it into games in a way. And I remember in the previous episode you were mentioning like ARGs, so alternative reality games. There are opportunities to create kind of secret games and puzzles within your books. Thinking about the choose your own adventures of the days past, where it's like you're reading a book and do you want to do this? Go to page 37. And then you go to page 7. It's like, oh, you've died, or go back to the beginning. So there's different options to kind of weave unique puzzle game-like elements into your books, which I think a lot of people probably don't think about when we're doing it. I mean, that might be one way to do it. I don't know. It's a really tough question because
and of course, if we knew that, we'd all be making bazillions of pounds. No, but tell us about that. So you're actually doing this, aren't you? Is it on Twine?
Yeah.
Nobody
Twine
would have heard of that. So tell us about that.
Yeah, Twine is a really interesting thing. It's a free program that you can download, and what it lets you do is create essentially choose your own adventure style books or virtual digital books. So if you think of choose your own adventures where you're flipping from different options, like there's a story happening, you can click this to see what happens next, and there's branching paths. But this tool is entirely free, and it lets you create interactive fiction in a really sort of natural way. So, and it creates it in sort of a game-like form that's based on HTML. So the final product of the game, while you can make a version that will play specifically on PCs, it creates an HTML website that you can actually upload and then have people play. But the way that you build these stories in this game is these little cards. So if you're familiar with doing, a lot of people, they'll pants their books and just go with the flow. But if you're actually outlining and using like index cards, it's very similar to that. So you could sit down and you've got these little cards called passages, and you create little bits of text, and then you can actually create little bits of code in HTML. Say, if someone clicks this, they'll go to the next card or go to a different card, or different things happen. And on the very basic level, there's not a lot of coding involved. You can do it very intuitively. But if you want to take things a step further, if you know HTML, if you know CSS, cascading style sheets, and a little bit more of like web design type stuff, you can really take things to a different level where it becomes more of a game. You can use variables and functions and nerdy stuff that probably most folks listening aren't super familiar with, but to create things like, so if a player has a specific item and then they click on this passage, something different will happen. Maybe they can use that item. And I'm sort of using Twine as an experiment that I'm working that sort of combines game development and self-publishing and interactive fiction in sort of this weird experiment that I'm trying. And I'm creating a book called This Book is a Dungeon, where essentially it's a game that will be launched within a Kindle book. So the book, you'll buy the book on Kindle, and then at the end of the book there'll be a link to get the game, to play the game for free. And the idea is to try to use Kindle as a platform to provide a gaming experience that's also familiar in that it's a story. But the book itself is also a product separate from that it's the vehicle for the game, but I'm also creating a diary of the entire process. So the game design, the ideas I'm coming up with, the challenges I'm running through day to day as I'm working on building this game, and also focusing on the self-publishing experiment side of it. So I'm writing about how this applies to fiction writers, and so it's sort of a weird project. So I'm using Twine, I'm creating a book, and I'm creating an experiment all rolled into one thing.
And will that
to see what happens?
Well, no, it sounds awesome. The thing that you're doing to document the process, will that also be another book? Because the audience would be slightly different, or is that more like are you doing a web posts or something?
Potentially. I mean, right now the game will be sold within the book, and the book is sort of an add-on. So, but in buying the book, you get the entire diary of the entire process. So people can, if they don't care about the game, might be interested in just reading the book and seeing what happens in the. They can click the game, or they can play the game first and read the book, or not. And the whole part of launching on Kindle is just an experiment to see like what happens. Will someone buy a game on Kindle? I don't think a lot of people have tried that, so it's sort of an experiment to see if that's doable. And I'm also creating a book so that people want to read the book. It's more than just a game on Kindle. There's a whole thing to it.
Yeah.
But it's sort of interesting because I don't think people sell their Twine games very often. Usually they just put them up for free on their website, but some folks do, and I think this is sort of an experiment to see, is Kindle an option to do that.
No,
but also just it's a self-publishing type experiment to see pushing the envelope and seeing what can happen. I love experiments, and so this is sort of a weird one.
Yeah, that's awesome. So let's talk about your indie game design company, Touch
Sure.
Fight Games, which is lovely. So can you talk about, because one of the biggest things that I am trying to learn at the moment, as in I have started to learn it and I need to learn it more, is collaboration. So doing projects together, because so much of the time as indies we do stuff alone, but I'm learning more and more that two heads don't just equal two, you can equal more than two, or more than that. So how do you collaborate with your other people, and how do you pick collaborative partners?
Yeah, that's a good question. With Touch Fight Games, it's sort of there's 3 people in the studio, and there's 2 local brothers that I made friends with a couple years ago when I moved to this area where I'm in, and they were kindred spirits, just like into the same kind of stuff, similar humor, familiar with games, familiar with they're artists and musicians, and our lead artist is actually a fiction writer. He writes kids books right now, and and he actually just got a publishing deal, which is really exciting. So it's sort of like we're all sort of these creative spirits, and I think finding people that share your passions and interests on a creative level is really important when you're building like a team to do something or collaborate, whether it's a game or a book or some other type of project. So that was, we quickly sort of knew, we became friends and knew like, oh, we should do something together. And the idea for doing a game came up, and we're like, whoa, this is great, let's do it. And then that spun into creating multiple games and creating a company and all of that. So picking your partners is really important, because if you do that with someone who's not going to click with you creatively, or someone who maybe not doesn't work the same way, but there's you have to kind of find that cohesion that makes it work, because that can cause problems down the road. And in terms of actual collaborating, it's very sort of a fluid process where finding the right people that you can work with, that you can take and give critical feedback to in a way that doesn't hurt feelings. You sort of build an understanding, like, I'm going to tell you if this sucks because I want to push you to do better, and vice versa. Or let's try this idea instead of that, or let's rein everything in and not get too. It's very easy to go kind of off the deep end with these type projects, like, oh, let's add this and add that and do this, and then suddenly you're working on a game that takes a couple months, and it ends up being like a 5-year project that in the end no one wants to buy because it's too crazy or too whatever. So yeah, just building those sort of creative relationships is important, and then finding a way to work together as a team. So you complement each other's abilities. I think finding people who are complementary to your own skill sets, that maybe bridge the gap and can do things that you can't, but also have similar knowledge of what you can do. That's really important as a team. We all sort of we have our own skill sets that are specific to different roles we play, but we also do things together as a team and all have overlapping skills that help round out the team. So that's really useful if you're doing any kind of project, to have someone that can kind of complete you creatively and do things like that.
No, it's something I'm really interested in. But you said there, and I find this quite the same. So there's so many parallels. Is you come up with an idea, and then what if you waste 5 months on it and people don't want to buy it? How do you decide on the game idea to build?
Yeah, it's tough, because being a self-publisher and a game developer, I kind of have my sights in both worlds, so it makes it easier for me to kind of use some of the skills I would use in self-publishing and apply that to games. So oftentimes there's a bit of marketing research involved, like what's happening in the industry, what games are doing well. But from a game development standpoint, for me, it's more of a creative thing. So we run it as a business, and we want to make money from it. But I don't want to be making games that I'm not interested in making. Just like you wouldn't want to be writing books that you're not really interested in. Like, if you don't write a book if you're not into the topic, or So you kind of have to do a little bit of that initial exploring. Like, we'll come up with a prototype, and then we'll check it out and say, this is interesting. What can we do with this? And is there a market for it? Maybe, maybe not. Has it been done too many times? Is there a unique spin we can put on it to make it different? That's a big problem in the games industry. There's so many games out now, just like there's so many Kindle books on Amazon, that it's easy to find things that are very too similar, and to kind of get lost in the overall wash of everything that's happening, churning in the industry. So you have to find those elements that make your project unique, your book, your game, whatever. And so that's a big part of our process is, hey, this is a great idea to do game X, and then we'll think about it, say, oh, well, that's been done a million times. How can we make it different, or do it in a different way, or put our unique creative spin on it? And that's really important, I think, for what we do. And I think whether you're an author or a developer, that's something to think about. So researching, weighing out things, seeing how you can stand out and be a unique voice or unique creative compared to what's out there already.
And then, I guess, taking that forward, once you have a product, what have you learned about marketing games that authors might find useful?
Well, this is something in my self-publishing world, I don't pay $1 for marketing. I do all my own marketing, very DIY focused. So I will put in the hustle to reach out to people, to get contacts and do social work and social media and whatnot. And so a lot of that applies to the games industry. We're being a writer and the freelancer in the industry. I know a lot of contacts at different publications, so that does help a little bit. But I'll create a launch plan for a game when we have it, and much the same way I do for a book. I'll make lists of who to reach out to, what are ways we can promote this, what's our unique spin or angle on this game that we can sell it. Because you want to make people interested, not just playing in it, but writers. We want the press to want to write about your project, and you want players to be interested in it too. So there's that whole like battle planning perspective that happens with both books and games, and I apply a lot of my self-publishing experience sort of in experiments to see like how things work, and I use that for the game development side of things too.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. I'm going to have to I really feel like now going into narrative development with games and actually understanding that, because I think one of the problems with telling stories as an author, you often tend to pick just one way of twisting a story, whereas I think gamers must think about lots of ways, and that's something that we can definitely learn from. But I wanted to kind of, because we had the virtual reality discussion, a few shows ago, I think, by the time this comes out. But what do you think is the future? Like, what are we looking at in the next couple of years of gaming, and what are you excited about?
Man, that's a big question. I think virtual reality is something I'm really, I'm a little bit skeptical of it, but I'm also interested in it too at the same time. I think we have a ways to go before the technology is quite, before we get to mention like the holodeck, like that's sort of like the ultimate dream of, being able to walk in a room and
geeks everywhere.
Yeah. We've got a ways to go before we get to that point. So I am curious to see, because there's a lot of smaller studios and indie developers that have been latching onto VR as like a focus, which is really cool to see, because you've got these big companies sort of building the hardware and whatnot. But I almost think that the indie development scene is going to be what kind of drives these initial experiences, which is good for gamers and people that want to play VR, because they're going to be more unique and unusual experiences. There's a game I was watching a video of, a small studio, and it's a 2-player game where just one person wears the VR goggles and they have to defuse a bomb. So there's a bomb, and it's a first-person experience where they're kind of tinkering and moving the bomb around to see the wires and everything, but the only way they know how to defuse it is with a second person who's not seeing the screen or anything, who has to read from a manual, and the game comes with a giant binder of all these different instructions. So like they're like, okay, well, what's the color of the wire X? What's the number on this screen? And they're like frantically going through trying to decipher what's happening on the gameplay without seeing it.
And it's
then
counting down.
Yeah, so the person who's playing is actually like kind of telling them, okay, well, this is what's happening, and they're trying things like press this button and then hit this wire and then hit this code on here, and then if you fail, you blow up. So it's a very unusual, hilarious thing to watch. So that's sort of the kind of example of things that could happen with a VR world that might be really fun, that you might not be able to get from another kind of regular gaming experience. But yeah, it's exciting to see what people can do with that and what they will do with that. And I think indie developers will kind of be leading the charge, because I know of a lot of studios that are working on projects that are specific to VR. I think they see it as an emerging market that will be a great opportunity to kind of stand out and set themselves apart in, because there's so many games out there that are flooding the traditional channels and traditional approaches to games. So they're like, hey, let's do something different, and why not?
Yeah, and it's fun. I listen to that and go, that would be really cool. I would really enjoy that. And that to me is not what most people would think of as a game. But what I also like about gamers, I think it's more about fun. I think authors of novels, especially, and in some genres, take themselves super seriously, and I'm so guilty of this. I take myself very seriously, and I see that this is basically people want entertainment, and what's one of the first things you said, it's about entertainment. And so I'm kind of hoping that there's more crossover around the fun side. So, because is that at heart what gaming's about?
Absolutely. I think it's really about creating experiences that people are just having fun. I mean, it's very cliche to say, hey, this game's fun. And as a game reviewer, that's sort of like what you don't want to say. Like, you're writing a critique of a game, it's like, well, that was fun. That doesn't mean anything unless it's very subjective. But that is sort of the quest, is to find these experiences that are different and fun. And when you do the same kind of thing, if you read the same kind of book all the time, maybe you get tired and you want something new and exciting. And, find the quest for fun and different kinds of fun is sort of what makes the game development world exciting, and how it's evolving, much like publishing and whatnot. I think there's so many great opportunities for crossover between games, interactive fiction, and the whole two different worlds colliding. That it'll be interesting to see what kind of things are possible through VR, through interactive fiction, through writers jumping the fence into game type development, and vice versa. Yeah.
It is, and it is. I don't have a physical book handy, but to me, everyone's been so obsessed for so long about the book as a physical object that that's the important thing. But as we're saying, and what I love doing on this show is talking to people who are taking ideas and turning them into multiple things, or the fact that the story doesn't have to be contained within a book-looking object. It can be a game. So that imagination, and I look at, I mentioned my sort of 12-year-old niece playing Minecraft. To me, that's what that generation is going to be doing. They will be, I was taught with physical books in a library, they're being taught in this kind of way. And I feel like being older, I need to expand my mind more because I'm behind the ball as such. Do you know what I mean?
I feel like that too. And I feel like I'm getting older, and being in the industry for a long time, you get sort of jaded, and you've experienced all these things that you're just like, all right, well, so when something really new comes, it's like, oh, that's interesting. But yeah, it's interesting to see how fast things are changing, both for publishing and game development and the entertainment industries, and it's an exciting world, and who knows what will happen in 10, 15, 20 years down the line.
I hope it will be 2 years or 5 years.
I'm
really impatient. I'm super impatient. I want to go to CES. Like, that's one of my, it's in Vegas, right? It's in Vegas every year. And it's a big tech show, basically, isn't it? For people who might not know. So one of my goals is to go to CES and take my husband, because he'll really appreciate that. He is a gamer. But that's where you get all the cutting edge technology, isn't it? Where you can see all the latest stuff.
It's a big, that's the big tech show. There's other ones, but that's the sort of the biggest one, and I think you'd probably have a blast. I haven't been personally. I've been to other different kinds of trade conventions, but that one is very much technology, and it covers the whole spectrum of entertainment. So it's not just games. There's all kinds of weird.
It's super. I'm such a geek as well. But, so if people, so you're also an indie author, as you mentioned, and you've put out a few short books to help people with self-publishing. Obviously this is more of an advanced show, but is there anything that you've learned recently with your own kind of experience that might be useful to the listeners?
I think one thing that changed my whole perspective on publishing was taking a shorter approach. My first book was a really long how-to guide on writing in the games industry, and it was like 60, 70,000 words for a nonfiction book, and that's about traditional published length or so, but I wish I had thought to break it down into smaller bits and make it a series, because writing short books, you can get a lot more done in a short period of time. I'm launching a book almost every other month this year, which is a little bit crazy. But what I'm doing is I've built out several series, and most of the books I'm writing, because on Kindle you can only charge a couple bucks really, and providing, because I'm mostly a nonfiction writer, it's all about providing value and having a good takeaway from readers, so they feel like they're getting their money's worth. But you can do that in 10,000 to 20,000 words. So most of my books since sort of had this shift have been within that range. And writing shorter books, I'm able to do more. I'm able to experiment more and be a little bit more risky with what I write a book, and it maybe takes me a month to write and then a couple months to work on and polish and edit. You can work so much faster that way and kind of pivot and go in different directions. So writing shorter books, I think, if you're doing nonfiction or fiction, actually, you could do serials, and which is really cool. I like that. The self-publishing guys of that podcast, they are champions of that, and really been interesting to see how they've gone with that. But doing serials, doing series. So if you write nonfiction books, writing multiple books in a series and linking them together, that's all really useful stuff. And that's sort of what I've been building, sort of my self-publishing world on this past couple of years since I've started.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And so, where can people find you and your books and everything online?
Sure. If people want to check out the Twine project I was talking about with the sort of book game hybrid, I actually set up a pre-order page if people want to check that out. They can go to thisbookisadungeon.com, and that's a page that tells you more about the project. And
this is not erotica, is it?
Right. Yeah, so that's sort of the newest project thing I'm working on. If you're interested in my self-publishing how-to books, I have a manifesto called Write Short Kindle Books, and a couple of things in the works. You can find all of those at www.indieauthorsuccess.com. And I'm on Twitter. You can find me at N Meunier, Meunier. And I love to connect with writers. I love to help folks out, share advice, chit chat. I'm a nerd for the shop talk when it comes to writing, so definitely please get in touch if you want to know more about game stuff or writing or whatever. I'm generally pretty friendly, like to chit chat with folks. So yeah, that's where you can find me mostly, book related wise.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time, Nathan. That was great.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a really fun. I love the podcast. So it's really an honor to kind of be able to talk with you today.